Elevation. We've been walking through the beatitudes over the last number of weeks in these midweek videos. So Steve has led us through the first number of beatitudes, and here we find ourselves today in verse 8, Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. When we think about the concept of purity, often our minds are led straight to behavior. Words like abstinence or sobriety or having a clean and sinless life come to mind. And some of us have spent years deconstructing the purity culture that we may have grown up in and the detrimental impact that it had on our own understanding of ourselves, our relationships, and how God sees us. For some of us, it's actually difficult to separate even the word purity from some of the trauma that we might carry with us from those spaces. So we just want to acknowledge that that's real and it's true. And you're not alone if that is you. And we also want to apologize and just express deep sadness if you have ever experienced these kinds of verses in a way that's been weaponized against you or a way that has made you feel shameful. We believe strongly that that was not the intention of what Jesus said when he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart." So what did Jesus mean? What did he mean when he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart"? What kind of purity is Jesus talking about here? It's almost like Jesus knows this about us as humans, that some of us are much more inclined to feel comfortable with a clear set of rules to follow, that somehow we find perceived safety there. So much so that religions and movements have been created and built by centering an agreed upon list of behavior that is considered pure. And so Jesus makes something so clear in this beatitude, that it is the purity of heart that will lead us to God. There's something about the purity of our heart above any action, word, or behavior that is what we are being called to and drawn to in this particular beatitude. And what does it mean to be pure in heart? Why did Jesus include this in heart piece? I don't know for sure. I don't have all the answers. But here are some thoughts, and we'd love to hear yours as well. There's something about the idea of being pure in heart that leads us immediately to a place of self-reflection and an inward focus of looking at our hearts. And that is actually an ancient spiritual practice that shows up in so many spaces, but one that we might know as confession. This idea of self-reflection, of looking inside and then confessing those things that need to be confessed, that need to come out. So some of you might remember a couple years ago now, we dove into this book, Slow Kingdom Coming by Kent Annan. And if you were here last Sunday, we had our mission partner updates and member initiative update Sunday, and we would have given you a whole bunch of information. And then at the discussion tables, we walked through some questions. And there was a question there that we didn't get to, but it was actually leading us back to this book to talk about some of the practices that Kent talks about in his book here, Slow Kingdom Coming, practices for doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly in the world. And one of those practices is confession. And I remember when I first read this book, and then when we walked through it together a couple years ago as a community, this chapter in particular really stood out to many of us. And there are pieces of this that I've carried with me since then. So we just want to take a couple minutes to go back and think about some of these confessions, and then how does it relate to this idea of being pure in heart. So as we enter into this practice of confession together, I'm going to read through these 8 practices that Kent outlines in his book. And there are many more, but as I read these 8, I would just invite you to sit with these and reflect on if there's one in particular that might be standing out to you that you want to sit with a little bit longer as we self-reflect and as we think about what does this mean to be pure in heart. So the first one here is confess your mixed motives. So we confess that we come to this work not as purely altruistic people. We bring our ego, our desire for success, our own search for meaning and healing to the table, and we have potential to hurt others in the process. We confess the desire to feel good when we help. We confess that we act in ways that feel immediately good to us. We give from a place of what will make me feel best and not what giving is the best way to help others. We confess our public gestures. We confess that we're tempted by fast and public symbols of justice rather than doing the real work of slow justice. We confess our hero complex. We confess that we want to come across as saviors in the story of justice. We are tempted to inflate our own importance in the story and devalue the contributions and capacity of the people around us. We confess our compassion fatigue. We confess our fatigue so that we can stay honest and sensitive to how this affects the people we're helping. We confess this because sometimes we need our community to carry us when our vision gets blurry. We confess our privilege. We confess that injustices weave through power, race, sexuality, gender, and nationality. We realize that sometimes we benefit from the systems that don't seem obvious to us. We confess the pain we have caused and received. We confess that we have caused and received pain on an interpersonal and national level. We recognize that pain is the cause of past injustices and that they are roadblocks to future healing. And the last one, we confess our longing for change. We confess our longing for a different world than what we have. We recognize that confession includes lament, and we confess this deep sadness. We confess today so that we can make new decisions and renew our commitments to ourselves, each other, and the world. We continue to live in the midst of tensions, hope and lament, longing and healing, progress and regress. And we do this knowing that the healing is gradual. Kent speaks of the story in Mark chapter 8. And this is a story that he brought up that has stayed with me for several years now. He talks about the blind man who Jesus healed. And in the story, I'll just read it here quickly. It says, "He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Can you see anything?' And the man looked up and said, 'I can see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly." This is a story of gradual healing. And Kent says here, we confess our temptations and vulnerabilities so that we can be healed gradually, like the man in Bethsaida, both for what we have done and what we have left undone. Healing helps us to see so that we can keep following step by step toward helping each other to flourish. And as we see, we can be guided not by shame that blinds us, but instead by a clear vision of God's kingdom. When we confess, we are becoming less and less blind. We are seeing more and more clearly. And it is gradual and it is an ongoing process, but it is one that leads us to, just like Jesus said in this beatitude, to see God, to see more clearly. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are those who look inward, who confess, for they will see God.